You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're discussing the Google Glass project and whether it represents the end of privacy. Google Glass is essentially a computer attached to a glasses frame that can broadcast what the wearer is seeing to the world and provide the wearer with more information about what is being seen. The augmented reality glass aims to provide is reminiscent of science fiction films such as The Terminator, and it naturally raises a whole range of questions. What will glass be most useful for? Will it be more or less distracting for the wearer than a mobile phone? And how will we know we are not being recorded when we chat to somebody who is wearing it? The glasses, priced at $1,500 each, are due to go on the market at the end of this year. But the backlash has already started, with a dive bar in Seattle pre-emptively banning glass because it says many of its patrons don't want people to know that they are there. But does glass actually represent anything new, or is it simply taking already existing elements of life, such as camera phones or CCTV, and putting them together in a more powerful package? And how will it change the way we live and the social norms we accept? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Jack Schofield, a Guardian columnist and ZDNet blogger, Matt Owen, who is head of social media at eConsultancy, a resource for digital marketers, and Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is James Martin Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. So I want to start by asking Jack Schofield, how big do you think the privacy issue with Google Glass actually is?
It obviously depends whether anybody buys Google Glass or not, but assuming a large number of people do, then the privacy is going to be the major issue, much bigger than technology or any practical value it might have.
And which areas of privacy do you think are going to be most controversial?
Well, when anybody is in what you might call a leisure situation, when they're in pubs and clubs and changing rooms and toilets and going about their personal business, and they certainly wouldn't like to be filmed.
Dr. Anders Sandberg, do you agree with that?
I think it's true, but what we regard as public and leisure and private, that is shifting all the time. And sometimes different people have very different views. When I'm in a restaurant in the evening, quite often that's work. I'm sitting together with my fellow researchers and we're coming up with ideas. We might actually want to document and record that. Meanwhile, the other patrons at the restaurant probably don't want to be documented, although they have no clue that what we might use their background chat for.
And Matt Owen, I mean, this bar in Seattle has already banned Google Glass. I mean, couldn't every private space simply ban glass from being used?
Well, it could, but I think it's a matter of perception because every time you go out onto the street anywhere in London, for example, you're almost always being filmed. People are always watching you and tracking you in some way. And there's nothing to stop me going into a bar now with my phone recording in my pocket or taking pictures, that kind of thing. So I think it's just the fact that it's a new technology that's got people worried rather than the reality of what will happen with it.
Well, it's in your face. I mean, absolutely, literally in your face. I mean, in fact, we do have this problem already with the idea of life logging. One of the Cambridge researchers called Lindsay Williams from when she was at Microsoft designed a thing called the SenseCam, which was a wearable camera, so you could hang it around your neck, fasten it to a lapel, and it would take photographs throughout the day depending on what you were doing. So if you sat there doing nothing, it wouldn't take any photographs, but if you cycled through Cambridge, it would sense the motion and the change of light and would take lots of photographs, and you could replay these. And of course, she was working with a hospital, and it's very valuable for example, Alzheimer's patients who can say, who can actually find out what they did during the day, even if they can't remember it. They have a photographic record. Another Microsoft researcher called Gordon Bell is working on a project called My Life Bits, where he records everything that he does. So you have a handful of people who have been doing this and running into more or less problems with people who don't like being photographed. The big question that Google Glass poses is not can half a dozen researchers get away with doing this, but what happens if there are 5 million people doing it, or 50 million people, or 500 million? Because it becomes, in that sense, unstoppable. I mean, you can't go round and stop everybody. This is the problem. We've already had this with mobile phones. If only one person wanted to film a concert, you could stop them. But if you've got 50,000 people all waving their phones in the air, there's absolutely no way you can stop that.
This is the question, isn't it? It's true that we do have CCTV out there, which is, in theory, the authorities can watch us walking down the high street. But if you're talking about millions of people who are all doing different things with recordings that they've created, that is a qualitatively different environment for us to be in, isn't it?
I think it is. I mean, it does sort of change the nature of the public space very much. Now, if you go to any website, there will be 20 different systems tracking your behavior on that website. And businesses are looking at a way to sort of connect the information between the way that you behave in real life and the way that you behave online, for example, so that they can sort of generate a single kind of experience for you, and everything will become more personalized to you. My personal feeling is that people will react by perhaps becoming more aware of this connectivity. At the moment, if I've got a phone and I go into a store and the store can track that I'm in the store and give me a special offer based on that or something like along those lines, then that's not really something that I'd be thinking about. But I think if it's very much in my vision, I think that people will become more careful about that and will be more interested in their own privacy settings and things. Recently, in the UK, there was sort of a cookie law passed, or attempted to be passed anyway, where websites would have to tell you how they were tracking you when you arrived, or that they were tracking you when you arrived on them. And it's all sort of come to a big nothing, really, and it's sort of quietly being brushed under the carpet now, because in most cases, people using those sites don't seem to care so much that they're being tracked. As long as they're vaguely aware that it's going on, then they're like, well, that's fine. If you can serve me up a slightly cheaper toaster because you know that I use your website a lot, then I'm happy with that.
Anders Sandberg, because Google Glass is such an obvious thing in a way. It's like literally a thing that you wear on your face, and you're looking at somebody, and the link between you being recorded and the fact that somebody is looking at you is so obvious. Do you think it's going to create a heightened awareness of privacy issues, as has just been suggested?
I think that's entirely true. I remember interacting with some people doing live logging, and it's kind of an interesting experience knowing that I'm being recorded right now while having this typical nerdy discussion at a scientific conference. So in a sense, the fact that Google Glasses are fairly overt is actually perhaps a good thing. The real problem might, of course, be all the secret documentation that is happening without us noticing from surrounding surveillance cameras and other equipment.
And would you use Google Glass yourself?
Certainly. I'm enough of a nerd to constantly want to get new information.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Google Glass project and whether it represents the end of privacy. Jack Schofield, the difficulty here is also that the organisation behind Google Glass is this incredible kind of churning of information for purposes that we can't even really understand. You might look at somebody and be able to kind of instantly Google them and find out who they are. And what do you make of that? Is this going to be a problem for us?
It is true that one of the most difficult parts of the whole wearable computing idea is going to be when face recognition and gait recognition and similar forms of biometric identification become pretty much foolproof, so that you can, if you see somebody across the street, you can find out who they are, and you can look them up. You can Google them, so you're basically, that becomes an even more significant loss of privacy. And of course, the interesting thing about things like gait recognition is you can actually recognize people from the way they walk or from the way they move their hands and so on. If you've got enough clues, you you can eliminate the vast majority of the world's population on the grounds that you know they are not on Piccadilly on a Tuesday morning or whatever. So you do have a fair chance of getting somebody. I mean, because the problem is that Google is personalising its search and therefore has the right, the self-appointed right, to know absolutely everything about you so that it can serve you with better advertisements. And it's quite Big Brotherish in compiling this vast database of personal information that the reason Google says don't be evil and presents itself as trustworthy is because people would be absolutely horrified if somebody else tried it, particularly if a government tried it.
That's right, isn't it? Google is really something approaching Big Brother. It's a gigantically powerful organisation. It's completely, unaccountable because it's a company rather than a government. And it does all sorts of things that we don't really understand. And, when we use a Google product, it just says, here's a long script, agree or disagree, and we all just press agree. And we don't really know what we're agreeing to.
Well, I think that's true. My opinion is that in many ways it's a good thing that Google is a company rather than a government. I think it's we're now getting to a situation where independent businesses have this ability to compete on that kind of governmental level and influence our lives in ways that previously would have been completely down to whoever was in office at the time or whoever's in power. I think in many ways that's quite freeing for people using these products. I think that you can never quite predict how people will use a product once it's out in kind of available to the general public. And you can never quite restrict personal data in the way that or messaging in the way that you expect you'll be able to. So the ability of just anybody to have this connectivity at any point and to edit their real life in many ways is, I think that's quite powerful, really.
But you don't have the ability to edit your real life. They're compiling your real life behind your back. And they're certainly not telling you what it is. I mean, if Google knows your searches and reads your email, and because it has 1 million or probably more like 1 billion websites tracking you through Google AdWords, so it knows all the websites you've been to, and it reads your email. It knows more about you than your mother does, or your wife, or your husband.
I think part of it is down
That's alarming, isn't it?
Well, I think something we're sort of missing there is the fact that Google has to make glass a viable product on the market. And we're talking about kind of AdWords and things and ad targeting specifically because that's the most obvious way of them making money from this, I think. But I think something that misses is the fact that ad technology as it is based around the fundamental principle that you're using a screen of some kind to interact. And I think the kind of heads-up display requires a completely different interface. And I don't think that they'll be successful by just overlaying product advertisements on our vision all the time. I think that they're going to have to think more deeply about the way that they do that, and it will shift the focus of these products slightly.
Anders Sandberg.
So one fascinating and somewhat scary aspect is, of course, the storing of the data. So gait recognition was previously fairly hard to do, but we invented ways of doing it. Face recognition is still computationally expensive, but we're getting better at it. In the future, we're going to invent a lot of other ways of mining the data which exists from the present. So in a sense, we're already becoming very transparent to the future. And we can't really constrain what the future is going to do with this data. But this is not just Google's problem. This is the problem of all our surveillance technologies, which suggests that we need to work rather hard on kind of keeping control over the powerful entities that have these technologies. But in the converse, of course, if everybody has cameras, it also allows a lot of local recording. There is aspects of surveillance, the opposite of surveillance, where if you have 50 million people with Google glasses, suddenly it becomes much harder for local police to do police brutality. They're bound to end up on YouTube within a minute.
And just to add to that, I think that's true. It's sort of once you put somebody on camera, they tend to perform for the camera. So if there's, I think it's quite an interesting question how it sort of mediates the way people behave in public when they know that they're on camera. At the moment with CCTV, it's quite kind of hidden away and you don't realise that as much. But I think as you said, if there are hundreds of cameras in your face all the time, that's going to quite significantly affect the way you behave outside.
Dr. Anders Sandberg, let's say Big Brother or Google or all these companies and governments, they have all this data about us. They basically know what we're up to. But does that impinge on our lives? Does it actually stop us doing what we want to do?
That depends very much on what these entities want us to do. So it's one thing with advertisements manipulating us a little bit. And it's a real problem, of course, with totalitarian governments who really want to force us to do certain things. But for most part, this doesn't matter much. The really interesting thing is, of course, as people start writing apps for these glasses, they're going to invent other things. People are going to do big data themselves. And it's very hard to predict where that is going to lead, simply because there's an endless space of possibilities. I do think that we're going to see a lot of ways of extending our exoselves, which might be individually quite empowering. It's just that at the same time, it empowers a lot of these concentrations of big number crunching and big data.
Jack Schofield, what do you think about that? Are our lives already being impinged upon by the fact that we are being tracked?
To an extent, yes, they are. You're obviously tracked by your mobile phone. You're tracked by where you use your Oyster card or your bank card. So there's already quite a large degree of observation, probably more than our forefathers would have accepted. And there's a big trade-off because people will do, as we were talking earlier about cookies, basically people can't do anything about it. The whole cookie thing is just a waste of time. People will trade their privacy for convenience. And that's a rather sad comment on the current state of the human race, I'm afraid.
But we don't have a choice, really, do we? Or
well,
do we?
Yes, you do. You can go out there and protest, and you can, stop people from doing things that you don't like. But most people won't, because they get 50p off a CD or a free video. In fact, as Matt almost got around to saying earlier, the big marketing opportunity for things like Google Glass is through location-based services. So as you're walking through St. James, it will say, hey, there's a restaurant just around the corner, we'll give you a discount, or if you're in a shop looking at, somebody can see you're looking at a particular car, and they could send you a message saying, we have the colour you need in our showroom in another part of town, and so on.
But wouldn't that be exceptionally annoying and thus prove a turn-off?
Well, lots of things are exceptionally annoying, but people put up with them because they save them money, or they make their lives easier in some other way. I mean, the whole business of coupons. Look at what people will put up with for a few pounds off the price of a flight.
One of the really strong motivators is, of course, not the money, but social status. So it might be even more important, status updates, things like Foursquare, where people boast about visiting stuff often. And that's, of course, even more annoying in many ways.
Anders Sandberg, is it important to be able to opt out of this kind of society?
I think it's very important to be able to opt out of almost any aspect of society. However, the cost can be very, very high. Choosing to not have a phone, for example, that's entirely possible. It's a kind of human right, except that if you don't have a phone, you're going to have a very hard time actually having even a normal work in modern society. So I think there are certain technologies that are assumed that you have and that are integrated. I think it's going to take a while before this kind of personal life recording becomes mandatory. It's slightly different from the phones. But it wouldn't surprise me that different media generations are going to react to it very strongly. I belong to the old-fashioned media generation that believes that cell phones are for making phone calls. And my younger friends think that that's strange because I'm not messaging them all the time. And I'm not using Twitter. So we might have different generations finding different uses of the same equipment.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Google Glass project and whether it represents the end of privacy. Joining me to discuss this are Jack Schofield, Guardian columnist and ZDNet blogger, Matt Owen, who is head of social media at eConsultancy, and Dr. Anders Sandberg of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Jack Schofield, do you think that the sort of young teenagers of today will even have this discussion about, you know, the kind of privacy issue that something like Google Glass raises?
On their current form, it doesn't look like it. It's going to be very difficult, and is already difficult with things like Facebook, because young people tend to act irresponsibly. It's one of the great benefits of being young, but they tend to act irresponsibly on the basis that it will all be forgotten when they've finished university and got a job and started to settle down and so on. They're already leaving indelible trails through social networks, and those trails are going to become really, really difficult impossible to erase with something like Google Glass. You already have a major problem with what they call sexting, which is, you know, sending essentially pornographic pictures, which is, if you were two 14-year-olds, that's kind of hard to object to. But if it's a 60-year-old and a 14-year-old, then that becomes a social problem. Now, you know, you've got Google Street View, and the first thing you're going to get with Google Glass is Google Bedroom View. That's certainly going to change the way people relate.
In many ways, we adapt our social norms, and maybe in the long run we're going to become more tolerant. However, that takes a while, which means that we're going to see a rather few turbulent years ahead.
Well, the technology moves faster than people. People don't change very quickly, and technology does change very quickly.
Matt Owen, are you comfortable with the idea of having a sort of data record of everything that you do, ultimately?
Probably not, to be honest, as much as I, you know, like this kind of technology and like the opportunities. Again, I think it's down to me personally, kind of making sure that I'm educated about these things and knowing how I can and can't interact with certain things and where things can go. I mean, even now, you know, people say don't put certain things on Facebook, because when you're applying for a job, almost guaranteed that your would-be employer will check your Facebook and make sure that you're, you know, not a complete party animal.
But should it be up to us? I mean, is it our responsibility, or is it the responsibility of organisations to simply not behave in a way which is ultimately unfreeing to the individual?
Well, I think that's a difficult argument to make, because ultimately a lot of these organisations are trying to make money. So the way that they use our information is, well, the best example is sort of Facebook says it's a free service, but obviously it's not. You're paying for Facebook with your personal data, which it's using to generate ad revenue, and it's not particularly clear on those points, despite the fact that your Facebook feed is littered with ads.
That's
usually
exactly the same as Google Search or Gmail or anything else. I mean, all of those free services work on exactly the same basis. It's nothing to do with Facebook in particular.
The only person we have any moral control over is ourselves.
Yeah. One of the things that really worries me from personal experience is that although these things, big data mining and so on, is meant to be wonderfully accurate, but I know for a fact it's not. As somebody who answers questions that, you know, sent in by members by Guardian readers, I also do a lot of searching on, you know, fairly obscure topics, just as I search on C. difficile and hospital illnesses and things. So I know that Google Search has a completely distorted idea of what I might be like. One of the most interesting thing in Minority Report, you know, the whole basis of the movie, was that you could arrest people for crimes before they committed them. In other words, we could see from this man's behaviour that he was going to do X, Y, Z at a certain time. And this predictive technology is going to be the basis on which Google Glass is used to make money.
But do you think, I mean, imagine we've got millions of people wearing Google Glass. That's so much data. Can it be mined? I mean, isn't it just simply too much?
Almost certainly it can be mined. The growth in computer power is simply amazing, and we're still surprisingly far away from any hard limits. And even if you can't mine it today, you can still store a lot of it. And in 10 years' time, not only are we going to have bigger computers, we're also going to have much more clever algorithms.
Matt Owen, do you think we're going to see a serious backlash against some of this stuff?
As we've said, sort of over time, social norms and general practices kind of evolve, however slowly that might be. and we kind of accept these things into our lives usually in quite different ways than the people producing them initially expect. I know, like text messaging, for example, was a kind of half-hearted add-on to phones, and it was just something that they thought, oh, well, nobody will ever use it. It's just something that happens to be available. And that was because of the way that sort of cell phones and things were priced and put on the market. Texting became massively popular. And, as you were saying, sort of a lot of people probably text more often than they actually call from their mobile phone now. So I think we'll find our place, or the technology will find its place in our lives.
Jack Schofield, do you agree with that?
It's unfortunately the millennia-old problem of swords and ploughshares. You cannot invent a technology that can only be used for good and cannot be used for evil. The mass observation aspect is worrying, but people can already go to shops that bill themselves as spy shops and buy buttonhole cameras and recorders with hidden cameras and hidden recorders. They can already do invasive things. Currently, of course, they're quite likely to get jailed for it, and I wholly approve of that. Google Glass presents a difficult situation because it may make it may allow you to do things that you wouldn't without getting jailed for them, but that perhaps you ought to be jailed for. So that's tricky. But if the emphasis is on the enhancement, the augmentation of your life, then I think it will be quite well accepted. If the emphasis is on the recording aspect, the tracking aspect, the invasion of privacy, then clearly people are going to object to that very strongly.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time just as we were getting going, but I'd like to just kind of go around the table and ask very quickly, Google Glass and its implications for privacy, worrying but inevitable. Do you agree with that, Dr. Anders Sandberg?
Yeah, almost certainly. The idea of privacy, it's been a fairly short period in time we actually had privacy. We didn't have it in the old village, and we might not have it in the global village.
Jack Schofield.
I think it is definitely worrying, and unfortunately I think it is inevitable, not necessarily through Google Glass, but there'll be other people who've got very similar products, have had similar products for decades. It is a modern trend, and I think it's unstoppable as a trend.
Matt Owen.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, but I think we might be giving these companies collecting our data a little bit too much credit as well in their ability to effectively use all that data. Even as Anders said, computing power kind of increases. I think that it will find its way into our daily lives, for better or worse, I should say.
I'd like to thank my guests, Jack Schofield, a Guardian columnist and ZDNet blogger, Matt Owen, who is head of social media at eConsultancy, a resource for digital marketers, and Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is James Martin Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Thank you all very much.